So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to present to you what some people may think is now an extreme macroeconomic use case for Bitcoin. Now, what I think will drive Bitcoin adoption over the next few years for the immediate future are microeconomic use cases, such as the integration with the Kenyan micropayment system that panelists explained this morning here. But I think these micro use cases could actually lead to a macro use case eventually. I'm originally Icelandic, but I'm a physics guy. I learned how to browse the web in graduate school in physics when it just came out, so I've been around new technologies for a very long time. Before I start my talk, I'd like to thank Pamir and Gulan for organizing this excellent conference, which I think is really is very timely because it helps catalyze Bitcoin and sort of explain it to a wider community than previously has been engaged with this virtual currency. I'd like to thank also the early developers of Bitcoin, Satoshi, wherever you are, or wherever the 3 of you or 4 of you are. I'd like to thank also people who have taught me about Bitcoin, like Stefan here in the front row, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other people in the audience as well. But so let's just dig into it, see where it leads. So first, I'd like to outline the economic consequences of Bitcoin as I see them. Now let's go back 300 years in history. Financial crises are not new at all. They're really a very ancient phenomenon, as old as the human race. So we had a crisis, debasement of currency in the United Kingdom in around 1700. Who did the authorities pick to put the money back on a solid footing? They picked a gentleman called Isaac Newton, who at the time was a well-known scientist. Now, he used his skills as a chemist, as a physicist, to recall all the currency, reissue new solid currency, which was not debased. He introduced what was then a really serious technological innovation. He invented ridges on coins to reduce what's called clipping, shaving small trimmings of silver and gold coins. And he successfully prosecuted counterfeiters. One of the more famous ones was actually hanged close to where now Marble Arch stands. So he instituted also a deterrent against future debasement of the currency. So his rebasement of British money or English money lasted for about 100 years until past the Napoleonic Wars. Now, Bitcoin is, in my mind, more like a gold coin of the old days. It's more like a virtual commodity than a currency because it's not really a security, it's really just a token. And most of us, by now, we all understand what attributes these tokens have. The tokens, they are fungible, impossible to counterfeit, etc., which make them really reliable as store of value. But they're also, what's really fascinating about them, which is impossible to do with silver or gold, is that they're network tokens. And the network is really fast and inexpensive and open and reliable. And we have seen all kinds of network things come about in the past 2 decades or so. And there are certain economics which govern networks. And really, the value of the networks, this is sometimes referred to as Metcalfe's law. The value of the network increases much faster, at a faster rate. As you add a user to the network, the value of the network grows. So each additional user increments the value of the network on a superlinear scale, whether it be squared or exponential, nobody really knows. But it has been seen, and this goes back also to the old days of telephony, that networks really, they sort of drive towards a winner-take-all end state, where you have one dominant network and probably 2 or 3 runners-up. So think about Google's ad network, think about Facebook's social network, think about Skype even in modern telephony, that ultimately there will be one big winner, gorilla in this market, and a few runners-up. Now, there's also, so this network that has just come about 4 years ago on SourceForge is very interesting in that it basically applies and appeals to 2 distinct markets. One of them is the asset market. Bitcoin now has seen adoption as an asset class. Cyprus, what were people doing, right? And before that, some people who are really paranoid about inflation. So because there's token is impossible to counterfeit, people like to buy and hold. And that's a very small example of what's called Gresham's law in economics. Good money crowds out bad in the sense people want to keep it and get rid of the bad money. But there's also another market called global payments, because Bitcoin is very easy and cheap to send across the globe virtually. You can have authentication literally within seconds and clearing within minutes across the Bitcoin network. Then Bitcoin also has an addressable market in current existing global payment streams. Both these markets, by any measure, are huge. So Bitcoin and virtual currencies in general appeal to huge markets. Now, we have seen huge markets migrate into the internet before. We've seen online media migrate onto the internet. What is that? That's the ad market. It was a humongous market that gradually rotated from traditional print media, television, whatnot, into the global online digital media. So it grew. It's a shift, really. It's a rotation more than a creation of a new market. So my contention is that there will be rotation of some sorts from traditional asset classes and from traditional payment networks and streams into Bitcoin and other virtual currencies over the next few decades. Now, I've tried to model this. There is actually a model which is not an exact model, but which is appropriate to use in these circumstances. And it's a model which was invented by a gentleman called Norbert Wiener some decades ago, and it's called geometric Brownian motion. And if I model the growth of Bitcoin using metrics which are not that silly with reference to other internet sort of markets which have evolved in the past few decades, I get that Bitcoin will, in my view, easily transcend another order of magnitude or two in the next 3 to 5 years or so. That's not an exact prediction, but that's the way I would predict. I think there's a highly probable situation. Of course, other scenarios may come about because Bitcoin might see a contraction of assets out of Bitcoin back into the traditional payment networks. But I think what would more likely cause Bitcoin to contract are superior virtual currencies that would offer better storage of value or better means of exchange than Bitcoin does. So my contention is that Bitcoin will grow just like other digital innovations have in the past decades or so. So it's not fully de-risked. There's a lot of systemic risk still, and my view is not much technological risk. I think there's a race to the bottom in some sense to find the most efficient mining solutions, and that's what the ASICs guys are doing. There's at least one of them here today. But I think the main risk to Bitcoin is not technological, but political and legal. So anything that could suppress Bitcoin, I think, has to be a political event. And probably only thing that can completely drive Bitcoin or more underground would be something like a coordinated clampdown of Bitcoins by the G20. We have a lot of positive things that could drive Bitcoin. Those are both macroeconomic catalysts, such as another financial crisis, which is positive for Bitcoin, but not so positive for the jurisdictions involved. And then also what we could have is we could just have a micro use case, which is very compelling to a number of consumers out there. So there will be some sort of tension as Bitcoin rises between those who want to hoard and those who want to spend. And my advice to people is to do a little bit of both. Now, once there is a compelling application for you out there, go and spend some as well. Spread it around. Which brings me to my native country, my country of birth, Iceland, which is a microstate of 330,000 people in the middle of the North Atlantic, desperately in need of a new currency. How many ways do I like Iceland? Almost an infinite amount of ways. I mean, it's a great, beautiful country with volcanoes, glaciers, beautiful fields, even a small amount of forest up in the northeast, and highly literate population, all the metrics that apply to an affluent, educated population apply to Iceland. You find them there. There's also an extremely wealthy nation in terms of resources, natural resources. So you would think that everything would be hunky-dory in Iceland. You have all these educated, wealthy people running around in this beautiful nature, but no, alas, it is a completely broken financial system. So how many ways can I count in which Iceland has a broken financial system? I cannot count the ways, but I threw up a bunch of metrics which indicate how bad the financial situation still is. It's a closed economy which is ring-fenced by financial controls, by foreign exchange controls, and which has a big overhang of hot money still stuck in, waiting to get out. So it's an inflationary time bomb in some sense of the word. So, and all this was brought about not by the general population, but by a few dozen people who were, reckless, and some of them were unscrupulous, and who are currently, I don't expect them to be hung, like in Newton's times, but hopefully will be held accountable in some way, shape, or form. Next slide. But if you look back beyond the crash of 2008, Iceland regrettably has a very bad history of managing its own currency. I mean, people complain about fiat in the modern Western countries. They complain about fiat. The US dollar has lost about a 12th of its value since World War II. British sterling has lost about a 30th of its value since World War II. But Icelandic krona has lost its value by a factor of 10,000 since Iceland became independent in 1944. So really, I don't think Iceland has the necessary skills to manage its own currency. And the debate in Iceland now is much about what currency to adopt. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide because it just lists a few of the candidate alternative currencies, fiat currencies that people have mentioned as possible credible alternatives to the Icelandic krona. Now, which really brings me to Bitcoin. And how do I know Bitcoin? I know Bitcoin because there was a friend of a friend in California who introduced me to Bitcoin. So I started thinking about Bitcoin in mid-2011. And then I started talking to people like the developers. But being a technologist of some sort, that I dug into the code, I thought about Bitcoin, thought about the implications, but also I have a personal history which is connected to alternative currency. And one gentleman in the audience, we actually share that history in the sense that it was a company that our grandfather founded, in the post-World War II period, which my dad managed when I was a young boy. During inflationary times in Iceland, it issued its own private money. Now, the company was a construction company, and people in Iceland didn't know where to put the money in those days because there was a huge amount of inflation. So somehow somebody thought of, let's go to that construction company, we know the people behind it, and we trust them, and let's give them more money on payday and sort of buy like certificates for construction materials, which we might use in the future when we build our own houses. So somehow it came about that these vouchers ultimately became denominated in cubic meters of concrete, and they started circulating, and people used them to store value in those days. They would rather hold the concrete vouchers of this private company than the official currency issued by the Icelandic government. And it came to the point, I'm told, that one day the Treasury called my offices of the construction company and asked to confirm that they'd issued this voucher. And to a certain Mr. So-and-so, and Mr. So-and-so in Iceland called Jón Jónsson, but they confirmed, we have issued to Mr. Jón Jónsson this voucher, and what do you intend to do with it? Well, the man is here, he wants to pay his taxes with them. And then the flabbergasted person on the other end said, well, what do you intend to do? Will you accept it? Yeah, of course, we may have use for it. So I have actually lived through, and I was told this story when I was growing up, but I have lived through times where private money displaced public money or official money in a very small and very distorted economy, but I know it's possible. So I thought, why not just as an exercise try to outline some of the metrics, some of the criteria that Bitcoin would have to fulfill to qualify as a currency for a small state such as Iceland. Now, I just use Iceland as an example because I'm very familiar with Iceland. And think also of Cyprus, Panama, the Bahamas, any other small country out there in the world which is not really capable of managing its own currency. Now, market cap is an obvious criterion. Yes, Bitcoin qualifies currently as an asset which you could use as a core to form a monetary base in Iceland, because the monetary base is $0.6 billion, and the Bitcoin market cap has exceeded that by some margin. Regrettably now, because it's early days, I don't think it qualifies yet on liquidity, because the liquidity is too small in comparison to the imports which Iceland needs. So it disqualifies as on the count of liquidity, regrettably. Volatility is way too volatile, but I'm reassured because the direction of Bitcoin is always up, 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 sort of as a trend, whereas the krona is down, down, down. So I wouldn't hang my hat on volatility too much. Mining is a systemic issue in the Bitcoin network. Anyone who commands a lot of computing capacity can theoretically take over the Bitcoin network. I would like to see at least 2 independent, reliable ASIC miners deployed in operation for 3 to 5 years before I would recommend to any microstate to consider Bitcoin. So go out there, please build those ASICs, get them out, get them deployed. Exchanges, same thing there. There's a number of exchanges that are coming up. There's an exchange that has dominated the market. Some of them, you just go out there and judge for yourselves who you trust the best. But I would say that you would, for a country or an institutional investor to seriously consider Bitcoin as a substantial part of its portfolio, whether it be Central Bank of Iceland or the Teachers' Pension Fund in the United States, you would have to have at least 2 independent, reliable exchanges in operation in the first world jurisdictions for at least 3 to 5 years before you consider diving in a serious way. Now, governance, I think, is really, for Bitcoin, is really good step that Bitcoin took last fall in instituting a foundation similar to the Linux Foundation or the Mozilla Foundation. I think on governance, Bitcoin already has a structure which could qualify, and if in the fullness of time, they add a seat, for instance, for a sovereign to elect representatives to the Bitcoin Foundation, all the governance issues that the sovereign could raise could be addressed on the board level. So I think the governance structure is in place, and it's getting there. And mind you, ultimately, as I have lived through, the usefulness of a currency is determined by the general public. It's a democratic process. If people do not like a currency, they get rid of it somehow. If they like it, they hoard it and they spend it. So a significant factor of the population must have gained trust in the virtual alternative to the fiat. I contend to you that this may well happen within 5 to 10 years. So my conclusions from this exercise in an extreme macroeconomic use case are that hackers make great central bankers. That's my Isaac Newton did it. Why not Satoshi? As a matter of fact, I highly suspect that Satoshi is probably a reincarnation of Isaac Newton in some shape or form. So I maintain that money from traditional and asset classes and payment streams will rotate into virtual currencies, including Bitcoin, so they will see internet-type digital trajectories over the next 2 decades or so. And then, finally, I believe that the Icelandic krona is a walking dead currency. Either it needs massive intervention to resurrect it, but Bitcoin is on a fast trajectory to become an incredible alternative. So I encourage you all to buy some Bitcoins and to experiment.